Well, we're back together, and we'll just pick up where I left off last time. I left off at a major breaking point, the beginning of the war. The war began in the Battle of Lexington-Concord early in the morning hours of April 19th, 1775. And it would go on for exactly 6.5 years until October 19th, 1781, and the Battle of Yorktown. So there's a war. It's a real war. People are out shooting and killing each other. As soon as the news of the war reached the other colonies, they reacted in a way that you might expect. You might have predicted what they would do. The various assemblies started communicating and saying, we've got to do something about this. We've got to have another Congress. We've got to get together again. So by May of 1775, what is now called the Second Continental Congress began meeting in Philadelphia. And it would meet then throughout the war. So from now on, we're going to be having the Second Continental Congress, which I'm just going to call Congress, meeting and doing things that are different from what previous Congresses had done. You know, we've seen twice that Americans had met together in the Stamp Act Congress and what now became known as the First Continental Congress. They didn't call it that at the time because they never knew there'd be a second one. But at those two Congresses, people met, they took some action, they voted on some resolutions, whatever, and then they went home and that was the end of it. But the Second Continental Congress is going to be continuing to meet for about 6 years. And so it's going to be a little bit different. And we're going to start changing some things now as the war has begun. We're going to talk about, and it's just using the terminology, we're not going to be calling them colonies anymore. They still were not in this completely defined status, but I'm going to start calling them states, just as a term. And we'll update that. We won't consider them colonies anymore. We'll call them states. And we won't call the assemblies anymore, just to change the word, and it doesn't mean anything. But we'll use the word legislature. And it's just a word. But instead of colonial assemblies, we'll have state legislatures. But it's basically the same thing. It's the same people. They were doing the same thing that they'd always done. Their rules were the same. Their elections were the same. Their meetings were all the same. It's just a change in words that I'm going to make to sort of take into account the fact that things are different now that we're fighting a war against England rather than being a part of the English Empire. And we might ask a question, does Congress constitute the government of the United States? Well, that's a kind of a tough question to answer, and it's a little ambiguous. You can kind of go either way on that, and as far as I'm concerned, you can make your own decision as whether you call Congress a government or not. On one side, a government, in order to really govern, has to, at some point, be able to have money. You know, governments can do a lot of things. They can pass laws, they can pass resolutions, they can do all sorts of things. But if they're really going to do anything of substance, if they're going to really do anything that amounts to anything, they have to have money. They have to be able to pay people to do stuff. They have to be able to pay policemen, teachers, whatever. They have to have money to do something to be a real government. And the way governments get money is by, as I hope you know, taxing. And I hope you know that for the Americans by this time, taxing meant you had to have representation. That's the deal. That's what they've been saying for years now. No taxation without representation. So in order to have taxation, you have to have representation. And also, if you've been paying attention, if you've been following what's going on and you know where we are, you know that in order to have representation, you have to have elections by the people. The people have to vote and elect their representatives. Now in America, as you know, the way that we use that term, the people, it applied only to adult white male landowners. So you know that it's not all the people. It's a phrase, but that isn't very accurate. You know that it does not include women. It does not include people of color, which would be Native Americans and the slaves, the African Americans. It doesn't include farm workers, and it doesn't include even white males who don't own property, who don't own their own farms. And there were some people who worked in cities, people who worked on farms. They're not included. They are not able to vote. So it's far from a democratic society. It's far from including all of whom we might consider the people, but it's what they considered the people, white male landowners. So those people have to vote to elect their representatives. And if it's not done that way, it doesn't qualify. It's not representation. And Congress was not then elected by the people. The members of Congress were chosen by the legislatures. The legislatures would elect to send a delegation, 3, 4, 5, whatever it was, people, to Philadelphia to meet in Congress and act as the representatives of that state to Congress. So it's not representing the people. They aren't chosen by the people. If you view it that way, then you could say, well, wait, Congress is not a representative body. It's not elected by the people. It's chosen by the assemblies, or the legislatures. I forgot to use the new word. The legislatures, and they're elected by the people. So it's close. It's sort of good enough. But Americans have made a big deal. They've gone rioting because sort of doesn't count. You can only have taxation by representation, by representatives, and representatives have to be elected. That's the way that we've set it up. We've made a big deal about that. So Congress cannot tax, so it can't get money. And my argument on one side would be, since it could not get money, it's not really a government. It's a bunch of guys getting together and doing whatever they want, but that doesn't make it a legitimate government. But it's a little bit complicated. That's why I say it's a little bit ambiguous here. It's a little bit tough to make a decision. Because the other side is, if a government does, or if a body of some kind does what governments do, doesn't that make it a government? And as we'll see, what Congress did, in many ways, were acts that governments do. So although it may not have been officially a government, it acted just like one, and then you ask yourself, well, when is a government a government? If it acts like a government, isn't it a government? And that's a debatable point, and it's really sort of irrelevant, but it is the way it was. So what I want to do now, for the rest of this day's lecture, is to look at some of the things that Congress did, the actions that Congress took. As I say, were actions that a government does. And it starts with, and not necessarily in any logical order here, but it starts with organizing an army to fight the war. We've got the militias out there. The militias are going to be fighting. It started with the Massachusetts militia. That first battle was the Massachusetts militia against the British Army. Other militias will now be joining in, so there are militias. But in addition to that, Congress organized what they called a Continental Army. It's an army that represents not just each state, but it represents all states. It's going to be an army drawn from all 13 of the states. And they called it the Continental Army. We could call it the National Army. Maybe that'd be easier, but that means a little bit more than we're ready to do. We're not sure that we're ready to call ourselves a nation. But the Continental Army was organized, and it was organized by Congress, and they're going to be responsible for it. Sort of as an offshoot of that, Congress also appointed the commander of the Continental Army. As it turned out, one of their members had been coming to the meetings that they'd been having in their first couple of days. he was coming regularly in his uniform. He would wear his uniform sort of as a hint, 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 I'm available. He was an officer of the Virginia militia, and you all know that his name was George Washington. So Congress appointed him as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, but also said, Congress made this decision that Washington would also be the commander of all of the militias. He is going to be a commander of all military forces. So he's going to be able to have a combined military effort involving all parties, something that the British officers had tried to do during the French and Indian War and failed. They could never get the militias to work under unified control. Now Washington is named as the commander-in-chief of all forces, the Continental Army itself as a separate organization, as well as the 13 state militias. To be honest, it was not 100% successful. Washington had some of the same problems with the militias that the British officers had during the French and Indian War. There'd be times when he'd be fighting, he'd be in the middle of a serious battle, and then the militia would say, oh, ding, time's up, we're going home. And there were times when they wouldn't accept his commands because they said, wait a minute, we're the state militia here. It's state officials who tell us what to do, not Washington, not Congress. But it kind of worked, not quite exactly, but close enough. So it was Congress that made the decision, we're going to have a Continental Army, we're going to have a commander of that army, and that commander is going to be the commander-in-chief of all armies, all of the militias, all working under his command to have a central planning for military strategy. That was one of the things that Congress did. Now, the other thing is Congress, of course, has to pay for that army. That's going to be the big question. How are you going to get the money? And of course, money is always the bottom line to a lot of debates. I mean, a lot of issues always end up, what happens is, depends on the money. And as we said, Congress could not get money the normal way by taxing. But there are other ways to get money. And Congress used those, and they used it to get the money, and they paid the army, and managed to at least not lose. So one of the ways that Congress got money, a simple way that's sort of an obvious way, is just to print it. And we've talked about that in this class. We've talked about how people know about paper money. And so Congress is going to print paper money. But if you remember, there are certain rules about printing money. For one thing, it's not done by a government agency. It's not done by Congress. It's done by a bank. And banks are legal entities that have rules and so forth. And Congress isn't a bank. So under the rules, it's not allowed to issue paper money, but it did it anyway. And the big thing, of course, that you remember is that banks can issue paper money, but they have to have gold that backs it up. Well, Congress didn't have any gold. So what can we say about the money that Congress issued? Well, it's not really very real money. It doesn't really count. But Congress used it to buy stuff. And of course, they had to buy it at a big discount. It costs a lot more in congressional money, which is called continental currency, issued by the Continental Congress. You had to pay a lot more for continental currency than you did with other more real money, and certainly more than gold, because it's not quite worthless, but it's really not very valuable. And it was kind of tough because they would, Congress would go out and buy us some supplies from a soldier. They'd buy a crop of wheat to make food for the troops, and then they'd pay the poor sucker farmer with paper money that they've printed, which is, what is he going to do with that? Well, that's kind of worthless. So it's tough, and that's not a very good, satisfactory solution, but Congress did it, and they did use quite a bit of that continental currency. The other way, of course, that is the main way that governments get money is by borrowing it. And Congress could and did borrow money. They borrowed a lot of it, and frankly, most of the way that they financed the war was by borrowing money. That's how you fight a war. You borrow money. And so that meant they had to go to rich Americans to borrow the money. Now, a lot of times, if people lend money, they want to know, among other things, that they're going to get paid back. And Congress has no way to know when and how they're going to pay back these loans that they're getting from wealthy Americans. And by loans, they're getting real money. They're getting gold. And then they're issuing bonds as receipts for the gold, but they have no idea how they're ever going to be able to redeem those bonds, or when or how. And a lot of people won't make loans under those circumstances. Well, I like to joke with students and say, if anybody is willing to make a loan to me with no way that I'm ever going to pay it back, see me after class. And nobody ever does, because that's not the way you do it. What I find amazing in this story is that rich Americans did lend money to Congress. What? That's crazy. I mean, first of all, if you're ever going to get your money back, the United States has to win the war. And if you're a smart observer, you're going to look at this and say, wait a minute, this is a war between a trained professional British army and a bunch of militias who are a bunch of amateurs, and then the Continental Army, which consists of people that are not in any of the militias. And who are they? They're a bunch of leftovers and kids and whoever. And yet, that's a scrap bag army. And you've got a bunch of militias that don't work together and are only more interested in taking care of their crops than they are in fighting and da-da-da. And you're going to fight against a British army that way, a trained professional army? No way are you going to win. And the amazing thing is, they did not win. You can't say that they won, but they didn't lose. After 6.5 years of fighting, as I said, by October 19th, 1781, when the war's been going on for 6.5 years, we're still there. We were fighting. And it doesn't make any sense that we could do it, but we did. So you have to give credit to the people there. You have to give credit to Washington, who managed to get through it. And you have to give credit to the people who loaned the money to Congress under those circumstances. So Congress did get enough money. Beg, borrow, and steal. They got money one way or another. And they managed to hang on until finally, after 6.5 years, the British looked at it and they said, we're no closer to winning this than when we started. This could go on forever. So we quit. So that's one of the things Congress did. Now, this is the time that I have to break. So we'll come back and we'll look what else Congress did to get money.